From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern.
It's midnight right now in Israel as we enter the fourth day since Hamas invaded Israel from Gaza. Questions continue to swirl around intelligence failures on the part of Israel and global partners and over who may have assisted Hamas internationally. Prime Minister Netanyahu addressing his country this evening, saying their retaliation has, quote, only started.
The U.S.'s role in the conflict comes as the House is at a standstill with no speaker. In the next hour, the House GOP conference is set to meet and discuss their situation as Congressman Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise jockey for position.
We'll speak this hour with Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, as well as retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. Anne-Marie, welcome back to Washington. It's great to have you here and amazing to see how quickly developments are emerging from Israel. The reaction now beginning officially from Washington as lawmakers come back to town, remembering 1 week ago right now, we were up on Capitol Hill talking to lawmakers about the fact that they averted a government shutdown.
Right.
A lot has happened.
A lot has happened. It's going to be harder not just to deal with the government shutdown, but on top of this, potentially more aid to Israel, coupled with that, aid to Ukraine, which already lawmakers were very concerned about. Horrific images, Joe, over the weekend. President Biden just released a statement in the last hour. He talks about that this is not some distant tragedy. The ties between Israel and the United States run deep, he says. It's personal, he says, for so many American families who are feeling the pain of this attack and this moment of heartbreak. The American people stand shoulder to shoulder with Israelis. But, Joe, he says that we know that 11 American citizens were among those dead, and also that likely Americans are being held hostage in Gaza.
Well, that's absolutely right, and that's where we begin with Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams. Nick, it's great to have you with us here at the table. What's happening inside the White House right now as they figure out next steps, knowing, as Anne-Marie mentioned, there may well be Americans in the line of fire as Israel begins its response?
Right. I mean, I think there are a few things happening here. One is obviously, what do you do about these hostages? There are reports from the region that Hamas is saying, to Israel, if you don't give us warning of places within Gaza that you're going to strike, we're going to kill one hostage. So that obviously raises the stakes really significantly. The other is weapons supplies to Israel. U.S. officials are saying, obviously, they're going to project a bipartisan front, give Israel essentially what it needs. So they're going to be sorting through the decision on what to do there. And then the broader questions are already being asked. What was the degree of Iran's involvement? Why was this such a huge intelligence failure? And for those questions, I mean, we are just only at the beginning.
One of the biggest concerns right now is Israel decides to have a massive conscription, the biggest they've ever seen in their history, 300,000. And they're dealing with Gaza right now. But what if there's another Iranian-backed proxy in the region, like Hezbollah or like the Houthis, that then come in and get involved?
Right. I mean, this is the thing that's such a huge question, and why this moment it feels like we're on a little bit of a precipice, because we just don't know which way this is going to go. I mean, I think one of the things that feels certain is you can expect that Israeli forces will go into Gaza on the ground, not just airstrikes. But when Prime Minister Netanyahu talks about, the response has only just begun, I mean, it feels like a ground invasion into Gaza is going to be inevitable. But then the question of, does this get turned into a wider war? What happens with Lebanon? I mean, you're already seeing pictures, people fleeing, traffic jams there as people leave their homes in fear of what could come next. And then the Iran question. I mean, there's a lot of conflicting information about how deeply Iran was involved in this. Would there be some sort of Israeli action against Iran? The U.S. focus for so long has been de-escalation with Iran. They were going to want to potentially keep that up, or did they say no, that is no longer our policy? So big questions still lingering out there.
Yeah, certainly. Nick Wadhams, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams runs our national security team here in Washington, D.C. We want to continue the conversation now with Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you had an incredibly busy weekend. Let's just start where Nick left off in terms of the intelligence failure. Israel is known to have incredible intelligence, especially along the Gaza-Israeli border. What happened? Why such a breakdown?
It's going to take a National Committee of Inquiry, similar to the one following the 1973 war, the Granite Commission, in order to unpack this and to provide a credible and serious explanation. I would short circuit all this by saying the following. I think Hamas got smarter in terms of preempting cyber and satellite monitoring by the Israelis. But I think the broader problem is a failure of imagination. Just like in the wake of 73, a conception developed. The Israeli called it a conception, that Egypt would not attack Israel because of the dominance of the Israeli Air Force and because of the ill-equipped and unprofessional nature of the Egyptian military. They underestimated their enemy. So rocket exchanges, 4 or 5 in the last 8 or 9 years of consequence, that's business as usual, even though Hamas fired a lot of rockets. It was the cross-border infiltration of up to 1,000 armed gunmen that the Israelis could not anticipate, did not prepare for, and weren't prepared to accept. And I think what truly stunned them, not that the Israelis underestimated the brutality of Hamas, one of their arch adversaries, was the Al-Qaeda, ISIS-like behavior of these gunmen. This was a military operation, but it essentially was a massive terror attack, indiscriminate shooting and killing of Israeli civilians. So, intelligence failure on a global scale. Number one, poor defense, insufficient deployment of forces, probably concentrated in the West Bank for any number of reasons, and on the front in the north. All of this, I think, more or less morphed into a real crisis of confidence, because in part, the real problem for the government of Israel is a crisis of confidence. A government's capacity to protect its citizens is critical to government legitimacy. And we're now 3 days up and running, and the Israeli Defense Forces still report there are individual gunmen still let loose in and around those communities. Yeah. Massive intelligence failure.
We spoke today with Ron Dermer, of course, Israel's Minister for Strategic Affairs, and he spoke to this potential connection between Hamas and Iran and these attacks. Here's what he said.
Iran is the biggest enemy of all, and they're pulling the strings behind the scenes, giving money, giving weapons, having meetings to try to coordinate attacks in Israel. And as I speak to you, Iran is trying to push other people into the theater of war.
He went on to say there's some evidence now they might have known about it, referring to Iran. We're working to verify that evidence. What would happen if Israel, in fact, makes a formal announcement that it has evidence connecting Iran to this attack?
I mean, I think where you're leading is with the Israelis, if in fact there was a smoking gun. And I think the Israelis understand that Iran is always stirring the pot. I think the Israelis know that, in fact, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps probably coordinated with Hamas, provided technical guidance, has been supplying rockets to Hamas. The question is, even if the Israelis understood that was the case, now would they want to risk an escalation with Iran, given the fact that they are about to launch in days or weeks, presumably, an operation in Gaza that goes qualitatively and quantitatively beyond anything they've done before? Do they want, at a time when they're going to be preoccupied, and it'll be an excruciatingly difficult set of operations in order to achieve their objective? The West Bank could rise in tensions. And of course, Hezbollah in the north, armed with 100,000 high-trajectory weapons of varying range and lethality. Would the Israelis want an actual conflict, direct conflict now, not via proxy? Israelis attack Iran and Iranian missiles raining down on Israel? That's very much an open question, at least in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Miller, can you imagine 30 years ago, almost to the day, you were at the White House and you witnessed an historic handshake between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, and What can you tell us, given your work in the Oslo Accords, about the context of these past 3 decades that led us from this potential structure for peaceful relations between the Palestinians and the Israelis to what analysts are calling Israel's 9/11?
Yeah, Anne-Marie, you and I could sit down for 3 days and we'd probably not finish the conversation.
I'd like to.
Anytime. I would only suggest the following. 50 years ago this last week, I was in Jerusalem. Just finished Yom Kippur prayers at a synagogue, walking home to an apartment when I heard the sirens wail. Trauma, almost 2,700 Israelis killed. The government would eventually fall as a consequence of this strategic intelligence failure. And yet within 6 years of October 73, in March of 1979, Egypt and Israel signed a treaty of peace, which has fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the region. So that was trauma that turned to hope. You rightly pointed out, it's November 13th, 20 years later, I'm on the White House lawn watching Arafat, Rabin, and Clinton sign this historic agreement. I was persuaded that we had reached a point of no return. And yet that hope, and we turned to trauma. All this suggests to me is that history bends in ways and in an arc that is really unpredictable. Could I predict that out of this nightmare, this tragedy, this Hamas barbarity, and hundreds of Palestinians as well, who have been killed in Israeli airstrikes? Can I predict, can I say with certainty that trauma won't lead to some possible opening? No, I won't say never. So I've got an open mind on this one. We're in for some incredibly difficult days, the Israelis are. It's going to get worse before it gets worse. But we simply can't give up. That there out there somewhere is a better future, an equitable and durable solution so that Israelis and Palestinians can find their way to something that you and I would call, as hard as it seems to imagine right now, real peace.
Very well put. Aaron David Miller, your view is important to us, and we'd love to stay in touch with you as the coming days and weeks unfold. Here on Bloomberg. Coming up, the battle.
And Joanne Marie,
thank you for being here. The battle over the House speakership. House Republicans set to meet in the next hour. The other story we're following very closely today in Washington. We'll talk with Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
The conference has to come to an understanding. If this conference, regardless of who's going to be speaker, if it allows a few individuals that love a camera more than they love the American public, we're not going to govern. If you want individuals that stop any movement, then blame the speaker because something didn't happen, we're not going to be productive.
Former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy there weighing in on the future of the Republican caucus during a press conference earlier today. That's as GOP members prepare to meet this evening to discuss the election of a new speaker. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Laura Davison. Laura, we have to start also with the fact that he said there needs to be leadership and I'll do what the conference wants me to do. He's insinuating he would take that job back.
Yeah,
is that a potential?
He's very strongly hinting that he's not going to nominate himself, but he wants someone to come out and nominate him. The question is, can he get enough votes to become speaker again? And it's really not clear at all that any of those 8 that voted against him would flip. House Republicans in just about the next hour are going to meet in the Capitol for the first time since the day that McCarthy was ousted. This will be sort of the first airing of grievances, sort of a vibe check to see what might happen over the next couple days.
So according to many folks we're talking with, that vibe check leads to a reality check that neither can get to 218. And the idea of maybe having an arrangement in which Patrick McHenry can be a caretaker speaker, maybe for 30 days, with the full power of the speakership to get a budget done, avoid a government shutdown, buy some time for the conference to coalesce around someone, whether that's Kevin McCarthy or someone else. Does that ring true?
That's sort of the pie in the sky idea right now.
That's best case scenario.
I think what happens first is you're going to have Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan, the two declared candidates in this race. They're going to have this candidate forum tomorrow night where they're going to kind of make their case. House Republicans are scheduled to meet Wednesday morning early to do their secret ballot where they, and then kind of based on that is where you'll see stuff happening. You know, if everything goes to plan, there will be a vote on the House floor Wednesday afternoon for the next speaker, but they'll know Wednesday morning that this isn't happening. And that's when you'll start to see the wheeling and dealing happening with Jeffries, happening with, with moderates on both sides. Okay, can we somehow come to a short-term temporary solution? Not unlike what happened with government funding,
right.
Is that now everything in government, both funding, the leadership, everything could be temporary, which would be really quite something.
We'll make the speaker itself a continuing resolution is, I guess, where we're going here. Laura, great to have you. Many thanks to Bloomberg's Laura Davison. As we turn now for more with Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, who's, of course, watching all of this unfold from the other side of the aisle. Congressman, it's great to see you. Welcome back. As you watch this from your perch as a Democrat, will Democrats be in lockstep in voting for Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker?
Well, thank you very much for having me. That is usually the case. Each party will put up its candidate for Speaker, and the voting begins. Now, we're not living in usual times, and therefore, a lot can happen between now and tomorrow this time. I have been saying for several weeks now that Kevin McCarthy, he's not Speaker now, so I don't say Speaker McCarthy, but to sit down with Hakeem Jeffries and talk about a way forward. We see what's happening around the world today. We need a speaker. We need our government functioning the way it should. And we need to have both parties putting stuff behind them, getting together. Internationally, we are being challenged on two big fronts. Internally, we are facing difficult times. We need a budget. We need to fund the government. And so we need to be working together. And I do believe...
Well, What sounds like, Congressman, you're willing to work in a bipartisan fashion. So what exactly would the Democrats want for votes for a potential speaker that they think could lead this entire House of Representatives?
Well, that's up to Hakeem Jeffries and his meetings that hopefully he's having with the other side. I don't know who he would meet with now, with Kevin out, McHenry, and maybe the person to meet with. I don't know. But I do know this, that the leadership on both sides of the aisle need to be discussing a way forward here, and I hope it would happen real soon.
Well, I'm just going to guess that you'd be in a meeting with Hakeem Jeffries if it came to a sit-down with Republicans. Congressman, as a longtime leader in the party and in the House, correct me if I'm wrong, but is the Democrat conference or leadership in the House in touch with moderate Republicans about a path forward?
Oh, I think so. I do talk with Hakeem Jeffries a lot, and I do know that he and Kevin McCarthy did have discussions last week, and there's nothing to stop them from having discussions today. He is the leader of our party. I'm going to follow his leadership. When he asks me for advice, I give it, and I don't usually share it outside of those conversations.
Is there a Republican name that's being floated now that you think you can work with?
Oh, yeah. No question about that.
Who?
I've worked with Republicans all of my life. I grew up in the household of two Republicans. My mom and dad were both Republicans, and so I don't have anything against Republicans.
So you have a lot of practice, but is that a Steve Scalise? Is that a Jim Jordan? Or would you like to potentially see Kevin McCarthy get the speakership back?
Well, I like Kevin. I just wish that he would return that favor sometimes. I don't have a problem with Kevin. I don't have a problem with Steve Scalise. Do I have a problem with Jim Jordan? Yes, I do. I really have a problem with Jim Jordan.
Well, we keep hearing from people smarter than I am, Congressman, that Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise cancel each other out, and there's a plan here that might be cooked up later in the game to have Kevin McCarthy get his hands back on that gavel. Is that something that you're hearing as well? Will Kevin McCarthy, in fact, be the next speaker?
I have heard that, and I think there is some legitimacy to those rumors, and it may be the case. But that's up to the Republicans. They will put up a candidate, and we'll put up our candidate, and that's when the voting starts. And it may be when the horse trading starts as well.
Mm-hmm.
Congressman, we have to ask you about what's going on with Israel. The president has come down. He talked about the U.S.'s ironclad support for Israel. Are you concerned, though, about divisions that we've seen over years within your party, within the moderates and the progressives wings, when it comes to wanting to send aid and support to Israel?
I don't think you'll find much division on the Democratic side when it comes to aid and support for Israel. I often tell people that household I grew up in, I just finished talking. My father was a minister. He preached as often from the Old Testament as he did from the New. I've grown up believing very strongly. As you probably know, my favorite president of all times, Harry Truman, was the president that recognized Israel as an independent state and did so within minutes of needing to do it. And so I'm a strong supporter of Israel's self-determination, their security, and I don't think there's any division in the Democratic Party on that subject at all.
All right, Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you come back soon. We want to continue now on the conversation about the conflict in Israel. Former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy spoke about the violence earlier today and the role Iran may have played.
Sanctions should go on Iran's production of oil. Under the last administration, Iran was only producing 400,000 barrels of oil a day. Now it's 3 million. They're making billions of dollars. They are wealthier, richer, and stronger under this Biden administration, and they're using that wealth to fund terrorism.
Here for more on the potential repercussions in global energy markets, Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons joins us now. Hey, Kayleigh.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, you certainly saw the reaction in oil markets today. Both Brent and WTI rising more than 4%, the biggest jump we have seen in about 6 months, now at around $88 and $86 a barrel, respectively. And the concern here is twofold. One, the concern about potentially harsher sanctions on Iran, because McCarthy is right. Iran has been pumping and producing a lot more oil under the Biden administration, now north of 3 million barrels per day. And all of that supply has helped offset to some degree the supply cuts from other countries like Saudi Arabia, and that has helped keep a lid on prices. That potentially could be disrupted. The issue is it's really hard to enforce sanctions on Iranian crude. This is something Amrita Sen of Energy Aspects was speaking about earlier.
It is only China that's buying it, and it's very hard for the U.S. to enforce any kind of sanctions, given the route that Iran is right now taking to China. You might get a bit more vocal U.S. administration, and they had turned a blind eye. You could definitely expect some more, just a bit more scrutiny around those volumes.
But it isn't just about potentially sanctions on Iranian crude. It's all of the other millions of barrels per day in crude that comes out of the Middle East through the Persian Gulf and specifically has to go through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a body of water which Iran likes to say they control. And that is where like 1 in every 6 barrels of the world's crude goes through every single day. It is a massive conduit for oil. And if there is any disruption there, if we were to see an expansion of violence throughout the Middle East, that is a point of concern. It also is a transit point for a lot of LNG, and natural gas is something that has been caught up in this as well. Natural gas prices in Europe actually surged more than 12% today. In part, that is also because Israel ordered the shutdown of a major gas field run by Chevron in the eastern Mediterranean because of concerns about really safety in this ongoing fighting. So you're really seeing ripple effects across the energy complex.
Boy, there's a lot to watch here, Kayleigh. Thank you so much. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt joins us in studio with an eye on Israel and the hours ahead in the Gaza Strip. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Hamas started a cruel and evil war. We will win this war.
The whole country is still wondering and in shock. It's incomprehensible, and we're still waking up and hoping it's a nightmare.
The Palestinian people, the Palestinian Mujahideen, all Palestinian groups, and the Islamic Ummah should be congratulated.
This is Israel's 9/11. This is Israel's 9/11.
The United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
Israel cannot wage a full-scale war on a nation, its people, its land, its holy sites, and expect peace in exchange.
Hamas and the people who support Hamas are fully responsible for this appalling act of terror.
Israel will do everything to bring our sons and daughters back home.
World leaders reacting to the invasion of southern Israel by Hamas. As we turn now to retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt for help, the former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs is with us at the table once again. General, it's good to see you. What is the mission right now for Israel's military when you look at Gaza and the idea of urban warfare, knowing that this is a large and powerful military? This is a very specific job ahead as Bibi Netanyahu leans in. What do you see happening in the days ahead?
Yeah, first of all, I think we've got to quit thinking about this like a conventional war or even a counter-terrorist operation, and certainly not counterinsurgency. At this point, this is a hostage rescue operation. And many would say that the military is the inappropriate tool to use for a hostage rescue situation. What I'm concerned about is that the military is now going to find themselves in a position that if they do too much, that hostages may be killed as a result, and if they do too little, their mission may fail. So I think we put the Israeli military in a pretty tight bind right now. So they still need to prepare. They still need to be ready to go. But I'm not certain that a lot of the military in Israel are eager for the order to attack into Gaza and into Gaza City in particular.
Well, the president put out a statement saying likely Americans have been taken hostage in Gaza. Gaza is very dense. You're talking about very dense city blocks where there's tunnels also underneath. I imagine Hamas has put hostages in different hiding places. How difficult it is going to be for the Israeli military to find these people?
Very difficult. I mean, we would not send in the 1st Armored Division into Gaza looking for hostages. The purpose of an armored division is to destroy targets and, if necessary, destroy infrastructure, not to be hostage rescuers. But nonetheless, there will be a time for conventional war. But I think my personal view is that the focus of Israel right now ought to be, if they're not willing to invoke the Hannibal Protocol, where they give up on their hostages, then they've got to be thinking about this very, very carefully about how they go about doing this.
So to what extent can the U.S. help, either from an intelligence standpoint or something I might not be thinking of here, and how important will it be for the United States, for the State Department, for this White House to see those American hostages, if there are any, brought to safety?
Yeah, first of all, I think the Americans can support. We've got the Gerald R. Ford, the strike group in the region, which is not just a strike group, but it also has a tremendous planning capability. It also, when you bring in the United States, you bring in intelligence capability. There will be a time, if this turns into a conventional war, that the Israelis will need to be resupplied. It is fortunate that we have the war reserves already pre-positioned in Israel, and the president can hand those over at any time. Even though there have been some taken for the Ukraine war, that at least will hold over the Israelis until we can get some congressional approval for additional funding.
What about diplomacy when it comes to the hostages? I reported earlier this morning that Qatar is putting a lot of pressure and leading a dialogue to try to release these hostages from Hamas. Will Hamas listen to Doha?
Well, let's be very clear. We should be appreciative of Qatar and Doha for allowing our forces to base aircraft in there and conduct combat operations from that location. But I would also say Qatar could have stopped this operation from ever going and beginning. So if they have not helped us in stopping this. Let's hope they can help us ending this.
You made a reference to resupplying munitions. Kevin McCarthy was asked earlier today, and it was interesting seeing him, of all people, holding a news conference effectively as the Speaker of the Republican Conference, even though he's not Speaker of the House. He was asked about funding for Ukraine, funding potentially in a supplemental that we expect for Israel. And his answer included a reference to the lag time that it takes for weapons to be made. And he said, we have our own resupply to worry about here. We have to resupply our own munitions. And that he and Speaker or the Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries agree on creating a new supply chain, if you will, to speed up manufacturing of munitions. Is this a catalyst for that?
Well, we've had catalysts for the last 75 years to try to overcome the lag and the lack of an American industrial base for weapons.
Yeah.
I would not say this will be the catalyst. Perhaps this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back and finally gets some activity and actions necessary so that we have a larger stockpile than we currently have.
We spoke to Ron Dermer, the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., now strategic advisor, one of Netanyahu's top advisors. And he spoke a lot as well about Iran. I want to take a listen to what he had to say.
Iran supports the Shia militias in Iraq. They're trying to establish a beachhead, a terrorist beachhead against Israel and Syria. Now our working assumption is that they may have. Our working assumption a couple of days ago was that they hadn't known about it directly. Now it is unclear, and we'll have to wait to verify it. And, you know, when we make an official statement, we'll make an official statement. You can imagine the sense of disgust that we have. We have to send a message to all of Israel's enemies because we're a strong country, but we're tiny, and we can go from strength to vulnerability. I think people are going to see the strength of Israel, the might of Israel.
Jonathan Farrow asked him about direct evidence that implicates Iran, and he said that is our working assumption. Is that yours as well?
Absolutely. Hamas.
To what extent?
There is little doubt in my mind that Hamas, without the advice and assistance of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, did not have the capability to pull off such a sophisticated attack.
So full-on green light. Obviously, Iran funds Hamas to the fullest, but green light and actual logistics coordination?
I didn't say that.
I'm just trying to get a sense from you on the scale.
They don't need logistics coordination because there has been a pipeline to Gaza for years and years coming out of Sudan, coming out of Lebanon, coming out of Syria. And even now we're worried about this ground resupply from Iran going through Iraq into Syria and Lebanon. Most of this is brought across the water. So the logistics, like our war reserves, the Hamas already had their war reserves there. But this was a very, very complicated military maneuver. The fact that they could create a deception plan that completely fooled the Israeli intelligence service, the fact that they had a combined air, land, sea assault, that is something that is well beyond the capacity of Hamas to do it on their own, but it's right out of the playbook of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps.
General, thank you so much for your time today and the context. Retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, thank you, and hopefully he'll come back soon. Coming in the program, more on what is going on right now in Israel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
The first thing we have to do is no more taxpayer money going to Palestinians or any of the Palestinian organizations that support Hamas at the United Nations.
The human carnage that we are seeing as a result of Hamas attacking Israel is undeniably the personification of evil.
When I was your president, we had peace through strength. And now we have weakness, conflict, and chaos. The atrocities we're witnessing in Israel would never have happened if I was president, would never have ever happened.
Former President Trump, Senator Tim Scott, and former South Carolina Governor and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley all weighing in on the war in Israel today. Let's bring in our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Thank you both for joining us. Rick, is there going to be a lot of daylight between these Republican candidates when it comes to Israel?
No. First of all, I think, orthodoxy, if there's any still left in the Republican Party, would indicate, full-blown support for Israel, our ally in the region, only functioning democracy in the region. I mean, this is sort of core stuff within the Republican Party. And so, no, not on that scale. I do think it'll be interesting to see how some of these contenders distance themselves or contrast themselves with Donald Trump, who claims none of this would have happened except that he threw countries like Ukraine under the bus, when there were opportunities to show support. So why would anybody believe he'd do otherwise for Israel? So, and it ended very poorly in the Trump administration with Bibi Netanyahu when he went out of his way to, as prime minister, congratulate Joe Biden. He was summarily attacked by Donald Trump. So it's an interesting opportunity for this field to contrast with Donald Trump.
Jeannie, there is not much right now that Congress can do. We don't have a Speaker of the House. So whatever the United States does to respond here is going to come from the administration. What's Joe Biden's next move?
I think his next move is to keep doing what he's been doing for the last 48 hours, which is be in direct communication with Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government to give them all the support they need to assure them that we are here. They are our closest ally in the region. And then, of course, to try and ensure that this doesn't expand. One question about this war is how long is it going to last? The other one is, does it expand? I mean, we've been hearing a lot about Hamas, but, as we think about it, Hezbollah has over 100,000 rockets. If they or any other groups decided that they wanted to start as Israel takes its action in Gaza to react to that, that could be a serious threat, not just to obviously Israel and to the region, but to United States interests. So deterrence is critical, and that's why we've moved those ships there, and that's got to be, on the top of the president's agenda as he takes on a new threat that the administration clearly, like many other people in the world, was not expecting, as recently as last Friday to erupt in the way it did over the weekend.
Yes, certainly not. Also on top of the agenda, Jeannie, today was Israel when Chuck Schumer met with China's President Xi Jinping.
I also made a direct request to President Xi that the foreign ministry strengthen their statement on the Middle East, which didn't even mention the horrible, gut-wrenching loss of civilian life. I'm gratified the foreign ministry issued a new statement that did condemn the loss of civilian life.
Gina, I'd love to get your take on this because Xi Jinping didn't meet with Biden cabinet members besides Tony Blinken, but he had a meeting with a bipartisan group of senators.
That's right. And, I applaud Chuck Schumer for making that request and talking about the urgency of China standing up against what was a terrorist act on the part of Hamas and to express their condolences for the innocent loss of life. It is horrific. He was right to do that. And, we are still waiting to see if Xi Jinping is going to meet with the president, in just a few weeks in California. So we don't know if that's going to happen. But I do think it's important that high-level officials like the Senate Majority Leader are going over there. And that may be a step in the right direction. But we also need to keep in mind that Putin may be visiting Xi Jinping before he has a chance to come to California. And so I don't know, given what Putin has said about this issue going on in the Middle East, how that is going to impact the situation. So it is really a confusing set of circumstances here, but good for Chuck Schumer for making that case to Xi Jinping and the Chinese government.
Well, we're in an ever-complicated world that's, of course, resonating constantly on the campaign trail. Part of the news today from the trail was RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, announcing his plans to run as an independent, not a Democrat. Listen.
People stop me everywhere at airports, at hotels and malls, on the street, and they remind me that this country is ready for a history-making change. They are ready to reclaim their freedom, their independence. And that's why I'm here today. I'm here to declare myself an independent candidate.
Rick Davis, we've talked a lot about a potential third party, a no-labels candidate. Here we go again now. Is this advantage Biden or Trump?
Yeah, this Kennedy apple fell far from the tree. Look, I mean, first of all, you have to wonder about the seriousness of the campaign. It kind of changed his stripes along the way, so it wasn't well thought out from the get-go. And I think the Biden people were really worried about it when he was running as a Democrat because they thought, it just reminds everybody of the age difference and things like that. But they didn't really understand who his supporters were. Over time, it became pretty apparent that his supporters were really kind of a group of sort of conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers who came right out of the Trump coalition. And so now not only is it, hey, don't let this screen door hit you on the way out, but enjoy that Republican Party drain that you're about to put on Donald Trump's campaign, if indeed Trump becomes the nominee. So, yeah, I think there's probably a little bit of happiness within the Biden campaign that he's not a Democrat anymore, and now he's more Trump's problem than theirs.
There you have it from Rick Davis. Coming up, the fight for the Speaker's gavel in the House of Representatives. These stories all overlap at some point here, and our political panel is sticking with us for more on that next. An important week on the Hill. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Well, I like him. I just wish that he would return that favor sometimes. I don't have a problem with Kevin. I don't have a problem with Steve Scalise. Do I have a problem with Jim Jordan? Yes, I do. I really have a problem with Jim Jordan.
There it is. Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn weighing in from South Carolina on the Republican contenders for House Speaker, talking with us here just a short time ago on Balance of Power. This is House Republican members are set to meet about the speakership just a few moments from now. Back with us, our political panel, Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano of Iona University. Learned a lot in that conversation, also including his parents are Republicans, Anne-Marie. I was not aware of that. But, Rick, what does this tell you here with the idea, and you floated this a couple of times now already, that Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise cancel each other out. Donald Trump makes it even more complicated. Patrick McHenry is there to hold the gavel while Kevin McCarthy makes a strategy to get it back.
Yeah, I just think that it's more important today than it was on Thursday that the House coalesce around a leader that they can trust to get them through some of these difficult times. And these difficult times include, funding the government on a deadline between now and, November. To find Ukraine funding, to get a border deal, and to now address the growing war in Israel against Hamas. These are not simple things. And in a vacuum, sure, you ought to be able to come up with an agreement between Scalise and Jordan, but it looks increasingly difficult. So why not go back to what you know, the known, which is Kevin McCarthy.
Is that why he came out today and gave that press conference?
Yeah, well, he's not giving up, right? The congressman from California is not going to fade away and be quiet. And I think he saw this opening today, and he was outraged. I think personally his support for Israel is honest. It's not political. And I think it reminded everybody, whether it was intentional or not, that he has qualities of opportunity and being able to articulate a message, frankly, better than anybody else in their caucus. And I think there are a lot of members now scratching their head after this morning saying, well, why the heck isn't he our speaker? Oh, yeah, he was until last week. So I think that'll resonate with the caucus. It'll be interesting to see if there's a deadlock by Thursday morning, what kind of options might be there for Kevin McCarthy.
He was still Speaker a week ago tonight when we were all on Capitol Hill together, Jeannie. Jim Clyburn said this is up to Hakeem Jeffries. Do you think that Republicans, namely Kevin McCarthy, could peel off 5 Democrats to actually make this happen? I guess it's 8 Democrats, actually, to overcome the Matt Gaetzes who got him fired.
I don't think so. I don't think Democrats are going to change. They've been in lockstep with Hakeem Jeffries from the get-go. And, Rick's talking, and Rick sounds so rational. Of course this makes sense. Of course we've got to get the government funded. But that also was rational last week when they decided to have, 8 people throw him out. So I'm not sure the rationality portion of it has changed. I think if anything happens, McHenry gets the 30 or 60 days, some type of, caretaker speaker, and they try to get some kind of funding through. I think that's best case scenario at this point.
But we just heard from Congressman Clyburn, Jeannie, who he says he likes Kevin. He says he doesn't have a problem with Steve. I'm using his words. But he said he does not like or has some issues with Jim Jordan. Why wouldn't the Democrats potentially offer a route for someone they like to get that position?
Yeah, they may offer a route for somebody else, but they had a chance to offer a route for McCarthy last week, and they did not, for all those reasons we have talked about, from his support for Donald Trump to his going back on his word and his deal with Joe Biden, to him blaming them for the situation over the weekend. The list goes on and on. They simply do not trust Kevin McCarthy any more, by the way, than somebody, any of those 8 Republicans who voted against him. So I don't think you're going to see that happen. Could they go along with somebody else? Perhaps. But, for Democrats, really, this is the Republicans' job. They are in the majority. Choose a speaker and let's get on with it. They have got to do that. Or I think, again, they go with McHenry on a short-term caretaker basis until they can get their act together. They are just incredibly chaotic, and it is not the Democrats' fault.
Well, in about 5 minutes' time, they'll all be gathering the GOP caucus on Capitol Hill. Our thanks to political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. A lot of stories developing in Washington and, of course, internationally as we keep track of what is going on in Israel. All these stories and more on the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Good to have you back in the Capitol. We'll see you back here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.